Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you again to our virtual participants who have joined us recently and have probably stayed with us through the conversations this morning and afternoon. We've had a series of very interesting conversations and discussions. For the next part of our forum today, we are absolutely delighted to have our keynote address from Fiji and to share with us the remarks from how Fiji looks at the issues, the views of the Pacific Islands and how that fits into the larger geopolitics. We are thrilled to have Dr. Satyendra Prasad, who is Fiji's ambassador and permanent representative to the United Nations in New York, and Fiji's non-resident High Commissioner to Canada. Ambassador Prasad, in his role as chair of the Pacific Small Island States, advises Pacific government on climate and ocean issues, both within UN processes and in other multilateral settings such as the World Bank and high-level panel on oceans. Given the conversations that we have had so far on how important climate change and the role of SIDS is, we are absolutely delighted to welcome Dr. Satyendra Prasad on stage to share his remarks on behalf of his Defense Minister. Ambassador Prasad, the stage is yours.
Thank you very much, Darshana, and ladies and gentlemen, excellencies, good afternoon, good morning to those who are connected digitally. Good morning, good afternoon from wherever you are. I want to thank Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and Sasakawa Peace Foundation for inviting us to share some remarks and some thoughts this afternoon with you all. But first of all, please allow me to offer my apologies for Fiji's Minister for Defense, National Security and Policing, Honorable Inia Seruratu, who was invited but is unable to join this afternoon. In my opening setting, let me say that for nearly 100 years of Pacific's colonial past, the global narrative by one colonial power or another has been to project the Pacific as a vast ocean settled by many small and many microstates. The smallness in this narrative across the Pacific, one might think, has been deliberate, almost orchestrated to project states that have been sovereign for thousands of years, that have been trading and sailing across thousands of sea miles for many, many years, as lacking sovereignty, as needing protection, as needing a paternalistic hand to decide their destiny. This narrative of smallness, of lacking viable sovereignty, meant that others could easily assert that role of deciding what was best for these small states, defining what their interests were. This helped to build for many nations and their corporations the case for economic control of much of the Pacific. They came in no order. Whalers arrived and plundered the industry into extinction. Phosphate miners came and destroyed whole countries. Gold, nickel, and other miners came and transformed resilient peoples into dependent communities. And then the traders came in the blue space. This smallness allowed the vast Pacific to be used in so many ways. The UK, the US, and France throughout the pre- and post-war period used these regions of many small states for nuclear testing. In Marshall Islands, in Kiribati, in the French Polynesia, as we heard yesterday, some equivalent of 11,000 Hiroshima bombs were tested on land, on the sea, and below the seabed. For long, it seemed that the winds of change blowing in Asia and Africa were going to pass the Pacific more slowly. Decolonization was slowest to arrive in the Pacific and remains incomplete. It was well into the post-independence period that these narratives of smallness began to be challenged. Dr. Peli Haufa, one of the Pacific's leading thinkers, said this notion of smallness was holding the region back. two defining elements of this smallness narrative has been that the Pacific is a sea of disconnected islands. Their trade was disconnected, air links were disconnected. In the modern era, they lacked connectivity in the digital space. And by all this matrix used to further restate their smallness. Pacific civil society, its leaders and people knew something was wrong with this narrative. They needed no one to tell them that they are joined by history, by cultures, by marriage. The late Professor Haofa has said that the ocean is vast, the ocean is expanding, Oceania is hospitable and generous, Oceania is us, we are the sea connects us, it does not separate us. It makes us large, it does not make us small. And the Pacific demonstrating this and applying this to a modern day diplomacy in protecting its tuna industry demonstrated this in a great way. A unified group of small states in the Pacific demanded of the world and secured one of the most sophisticated tuna management regimes in the world, a regime that is now respected by large countries and small countries across the world, and one that is displaying the capacity for these states for their greatness. The Pacific Forum, the Pacific's premier body, took these ideas further forward and developed a new narrative for the Blue Pacific. This is a perspective that Pacific's leaders wish to share with the rest of the world. This 40 million square kilometers of the surface of the planet is an open, welcoming, and resourceful part of the planet. It is these small states offer to the world 20% of their languages, 50% of the world's biodiversity, 70% of the world's tunas, infinite resources for marine genetics, for our medicines for the future, and blue farms for the world's protein needs now and for the future. The blue continent, the Blue Pacific, is how the Pacific Islands wish to project themselves onto the world. As this liquid continent, the largest continent, the Blue Pacific, now provides global leadership in so many areas. But they also know, Pacific's leaders and societies also know that they are stewards of the Blue Pacific, as they hold in trust the resources and the bounty of the Pacific for future generations. And in securing the Blue Pacific, they look to the multilateral order. They look to a rules-based international system. Fiji and the Pacific's leadership in the multilateral space has been significant. Fiji and Pacific's leadership in the development of law of the sea, the constitution of our ocean, is widely acknowledged. And but the stewardship role of the Blue Pacific comes in one other way today as well. The Amazon and the Blue Pacific are the two lungs of our planet. The Blue Pacific is under strain from global warming, from sea level rise, and from pollution. Recognizing that this needed to be protected, Pacific's leaders worked with the international community for several years to ensure that SDG 14, life below water, was secured as one of the core global goals, and yet again demonstrating their capacity for greatness, for bringing global solutions to what appeared as national or regional problems, but which required global solutions. A rules-based global system has substantive meaning to the Blue Pacific. As large ocean states, we look to multilateralism for global governance. This is natural to us. It is a rock-solid commitment that we have as states. It is not a fair weather commitment. It is not coincidental, and this is generic to small states. It is not coincidental that Anga 76 across the road tomorrow morning will be opened under the leadership of Maldives, whose minister you heard yesterday. It is not coincidental that the UN's Human Rights General Assembly in Geneva is convened under the presidency of Fiji. We look to a future, we as well look to our future United Nations Secretary General who will come from the Pacific or from a small state, or future head of UNCTAD and other global institutions to come. When Pacific leaders last met in person here, in the region and here, they had said that the security consequences arising from climate change is the single largest threat to the Blue Pacific. Relentless sea level rise now threatens the very existence of many small states and threatens vast areas of the economy of all states across the region. And this week, Pacific leaders will be releasing the Blue Pacific Declaration following their meeting with the Secretary General. And I invite your listeners to read and reflect on the Blue Pacific Declaration. The Blue Pacific, for purposes of our discussion this afternoon, is also one of the most significant drivers of globalization in 50 years. This is a less well understood area. Some 50% of the world's trade moves across these waters, connecting the Americas into the broader Indo-Pacific region. They do so, this trade moves this way because these waters are peaceful. They do so because these waters are open. They do so because these waters are secure. And so, put another way, the rise and prosperity of great powers, US, China, Japan, Indonesia, Brazil, and the Americas generally, and other states that depend on this the highway of trade that is provided by the Blue Pacific. The prosperity of people across Asia and across the Americas depends on a stable and open and a healthy Blue Pacific. As Pacific's leaders now shape their 2050 strategy for the Blue Pacific, they remind the world, small and large states across the world, of the crucial role that the Blue Pacific plays for the economic well-being of great powers and for the health of people across the planet. A future beyond 1.5 degrees Celsius will mean that the resources and the bounty of the Blue Pacific can no longer be taken for granted. A stable trade artery that connects the Pacific with itself and that links the world's trading regions cannot be taken for granted with a future beyond 1.5 degrees Celsius. The Blue Pacific will generate more frequent and larger extreme weather events, and these will disrupt trade. A super warm Blue Pacific will generate more frequent supercyclones. It will disrupt infrastructure that is necessary for trade. The well-being of all trading nations will be harmed. On the eve of the first global summit, food system summit to be held later this week, the Blue Pacific will remind the world of its role in feeding itself and the rest of the world. It is likely that the Blue Pacific will become the main source of all of the world's proteins by 2050. With a future that is warmer than 1.5, this is a role, this is also a destiny that the Blue Pacific can no longer take for granted. So we remind all powers, large and small, those who are competing, those who are collaborating, that something much larger is at stake on a business as usual trajectory of global geopolitics. We have windows to act collaboratively. These windows are fast closing in. It is significant that the Pacific leaders will be joining their fellow leaders in the Alliance of Small Island Developing States in a couple of days here at UNGA to restate this case. When Fiji's Defense Minister, Honorable Seru Ratu, last attended an in-person discussion on climate and security in 2018 at the UN, he called on the UN Security Council to recognize the security consequences of climate change as now being persistent and having the potential to fuel growing instability in the Blue Pacific and globally. I'm pleased that these discussions are taking place on the eve of UN General Assembly 76, the most consequential General Assembly perhaps in a generation. We take note that the UN Security Council will again be discussing climate and security later this week. We welcome UN Security Council's first discussions on maritime security a couple of years back and thank India for convening that under its presidency. Paraphrasing the commander of Fiji military forces, Rear Admiral Williame Nopoto, at a meeting of the military heads across the Pacific region a few years back, he said, "The Blue Pacific is now a site of growing geopolitical competition, a competition between China and the USA, both of whom are friends of Fiji. There is only one victor in that competition, that is climate change." Said differently, in the Blue Pacific, in the competition between US and China, both friends of the Pacific are losing. You will hear Pacific leaders throughout the General Assembly say this in different ways. This was exactly the message by Fiji's Prime Minister, Honorable Frank Bainimarama, to the informal leaders' dialogue held this morning, convened by the UN Secretary General and by Prime Minister of UK, attended by leaders of China, India, Japan, USA, and many other countries. He said, "We have time to get this right. Let us get the job done at Glasgow." All Blue Pacific leaders will take the floor during this General Assembly. They will remind the international community how crucial the Blue Pacific is to the well-being of the planet. We know we have the means and the resources to win this battle and secure the Blue Pacific, and with it, our planet. It will make larger states larger still if they can find the resolve and the commitment to do so. The geopolitical tussle of our times is quintessentially a contest between those committed to returning our planet to a path of stability and those who are opposed to it. It is that simple. Vinaka Vakalevu, I thank you all very much.
Thank you, Ambassador, for that wonderful speech and for emphasizing on what really constitutes the security concerns of the region, not only for Fiji, and I think this has been a running theme through our conversation since yesterday, the issue of climate change and how important it is for Pacific and as well as for the Indian Ocean Islands. I wanted to start from one of the themes that you mentioned right at the beginning of your speech on the narrative of smallness that you talked about, that external powers come and talk about you are so small that perhaps we should decide what is important to you, what matters to you, what are your security threats. As ambassador to the UN and as a time, because your work really focuses on also increasing the attention on the urgency of climate change and the work that needs to be done. Do you still face that narrative of smallness here in New York in your conversations with bigger powers?
Yes, you do, but the UN General Assembly is a General Assembly of states, member states, and as I said, tomorrow, day after, the group of small island states called AOCIS is meeting, and that's about 40 countries. That's collectively put together, something like 30% of total member states of the United Nations. Seen another way, you could say that these 40 countries or these 30% of world's countries in the geopolitical configuration are a large geopolitical power, geopolitical force. And this is how we want to project, and this is how we believe small island states or small states are in the global configuration. So as I said in my opening remarks, I think sometimes the idea of smallness in a competitive environment is aimed deliberately to weaken your resolve and weaken your negotiation powers, etc. We need to overcome that, and we are.
Thank you so much. You are right that the UNGA 76 in a way is remarkable or important for a whole generation, with Maldives taking the presidency of it in some of the other UN bodies coming from it. You also talked about the importance of the multilateral order, the law of the sea, that a rules-based international order is substantive, is natural for Fiji. What do you see in terms of the multilateral order? What role does an island nation like Fiji would like to see play in the evolving structure that we're seeing in the multilateral order, whether it is between, you also talked about the competition, whether it's US, China, or it is, other players, UK, France. Where do you see Fiji as the nation within this multilateral order? What kind of role would you be hoping to play?
Not saying it lightly, I think it is not Fiji, but it is Kiribati, which is the center of the planet. It is the one country in the world which has all the 4 poles. So if you want to see it this way, that in the Pacific and at Kiribati, which is slightly north of Fiji, that is the center of the planet. So we want to think about the planet and planetary stability and the big global issues and frame them from that perspective, rather than a perspective of New York or rather than a perspective of from other countries. And again, it is not a light comment. We are also human beings. We don't think about the same global problems differently. But sometimes some of these global challenges come to us much earlier than they arrive in other countries. So this morning, my Prime Minister, for example, said that the recent climate stresses and crises that US alone has faced over this summer, over this year, has already caused a damage equivalent to $100 billion, which is a small part of the US economy. As a proportion, as a ratio of the economy, our countries have been facing that scale and more of damages almost annually now for nearly 20 years. And so many of the global problems, they arrive to us much earlier. We see their impacts much earlier, and we frame our response. We are ahead in framing our responses. And Law of the Sea is one example of that. Fiji and Pacific's leadership, the small island states' leadership on that. Other small states, such as Singapore, provided great leadership in shaping what ended up as the national constitution of our oceans. That is because these states were able to think about oceans in a different way and much earlier than other larger countries thought about. And it is not coincidental that the first signatory to UNCLOS, the Law of the Sea, is Fiji. As Fiji is also the first signatory to the Paris Treaty. These are not coincidental. This is how these problems come to us. We think about them because these problems come to us much earlier than they do in larger countries. And that kind of shapes our worldview, and that's why I said we need to frame some of the global discussions from the way in which we see it. And Kiribati, I mentioned, provides that a great perspective for that.
We had the ambassador of Kiribati just in the morning. So that was an interesting conversation as well.
And that's a country that is as large as the US. On the surface of the planet, it is almost as big as the US.
No, that was a fascinating conversation as well, and I appreciate you mentioning Kiribati as well. You mentioned that that Fiji and a lot of the Pacific Island nations don't necessarily see the world problems in the same way that a lot of the bigger players do. But these players, the bigger countries, are very much present in your waters, in your neighboring environment, in your immediate security environment. So how do you manage that balance between the perceptions and the problems that you see as the country that is living in that environment, between the bigger player who's providing that security, perhaps to the region, but may have a different framing of the same issues?
Interesting you put it. I think that is right. The way in which we frame and think about security is different from the way in which larger countries think and frame notions about security. Look, first, with US, for example, it is not a distant superpower for the Pacific. US is part of the Pacific. You take a long swim from Fiji, you'll end up in American Samoa, and a slightly longer swim, you'll end up in Guam. These are our neighbors. These are our family. These are part of our closer region. So with the US, our conversation is a conversation between neighbors, a conversation part of the Blue Pacific, and not a conversation with distant, faraway superpower. That is a different conversation, and sometimes this is lost in the bureaucracy, and sometimes this intrinsic nature of U.S. being part of the Pacific is lost when people are framing the discussions. None of when the extreme weather events hurt Fiji, it might end up in American Samoa, or it might end up in Guam, and their suffering is ours, as ours is theirs. And this perspective, therefore, is very useful in shaping. And then on others, the Pacific's trade and its commerce is with Australia and New Zealand, growingly with the North Pacific, and including China and Indonesia, Malaysia, Vietnam. And so when we are thinking about future prosperity, we should be thinking about these much larger markets from which we need to both be present in and which we need to trade in. And therefore, for the Pacific has been for centuries large enough for everybody. It remains large enough for everybody, but the fundamental part of it must be healthy, and it must be stable, and it must be open and secure. And you must have heard many Pacific or several Pacific ambassadors talking to you about we feel that when that notions of stability are threatened or this, then we necessarily must be restless. And but as small states, as individual small states, we have little leverage. As collective cohesive groups, we have larger leverage. And as collective cohesive group, we look to what? We don't look to nuclear weapons or things like that. We look to international law, and we look to the multilateral system to provide us with the rules through which we negotiate and mediate our interest and protect our interest in the global systems. And where these rules are lacking and where these rules are weak, then we work with everybody, including the largest countries and largest powers, to expand the framework of international rules. And that is why I said very deliberately, and perhaps it was a bit provocative, we are not fair weather multilateralist, we are all weather multilateralist.
Thank you, Ambassador. I think, we've, over the last couple of discussions, we've had everyone talk about the great powers in the region, whether it's UK, France, India and the Indian Ocean, but very few have mentioned Indonesia, and you've mentioned this twice now, so I thank you for that perspective. That's the regional perspective, the countries that matter, that you seek collaborations with. Just from your remarks right now, I have two questions. One was, because you said individually you might be small, but collectively through Pacific Island Forum or through in groupings, you do share ideas, you do share concerns and challenges that is collectively represented to the world, whether it is at the UN or whether it is through different bodies. I was wondering if you'd like to say something, especially as PIF chair, about the Micronesia disappointment or kind of the engagement with PIF where they are. Yes, we did have Marshall Island ambassador here who said they will be leaving PIF next year. So how do you manage that where you have about a certain number of countries walking away from the regional body that collectively represents the Pacific?
So 2-3 things for your audience. I'm not sure how much they know about this issue. So the Pacific has many institutions of regional governance, and the Pacific Island Forum is where our leaders meet, but there are many and several other layers of multilateral institutions at the regional levels, and so all countries remain firmly committed to this other broader set of regional organizations and regional institutions. As far as the specific issue of Pacific Island Forum membership is concerned, let me say that Fiji is the chair of the Pacific Island Forum. My Prime Minister is chairing that. It is a pity that we were unable to have the first leaders meeting of the Pacific Island Forum in person in Suva, in Fiji, at the start of Fiji's chairmanship in August, as we had hoped, because of COVID airline disruptions. I think that would have, if our leaders had met together, it would have gone, quite some distance in trying to find a way forward. Some of us were hoping that our leaders would have been able to attend the General Assembly, and that this would have been our second opportunity where our leaders would have been able to meet in person and have this term that we use in the Pacific, a talanoa, a good yarn and a chat about issues and challenges, and find the way forward. But that has not happened. Only two Pacific leaders were able to come in person. But nevertheless, Fiji's Prime Minister and Fiji in its role as chair is fully invested in ensuring that all the views are heard, and that in a nice Pacific way we find a resolution forward. And I'm extremely hopeful that the Pacific leaders in their wisdom and in good time will find a way forward, and that the Pacific Island Forum will come out stronger rather than weaker as a consequence of the recent issues. I'm personally, that is my belief, and I know that the Fijian government is very, very committed and working 24/7 on this issue, and that we will have a even better outcome. And sometimes, organizations like ours, we kind of take things for granted. They need to be tested, and this was a test, a stress test. We fell short, and I think as we go through these next few months, we will come out with a good outcome. I'm very hopeful.
Thank you, Ambassador. The follow-up question to not your the previous remarks were because you mentioned about in your remarks on nuclear testing in the Pacific, and also coalitions that might threaten stability and regional kind of perception. So I wanted to ask you if you might have any thoughts on the recent Australia, UK, US new alliance and the submarine deal. New Zealand has come up with a strong statement on it, but I was wondering, as Fiji or from a Pacific side, do you have any concerns, or I mean, if there was anything that you wanted to share?
I don't have any. I should, in matters like this, look for guidance from our Prime Minister, who's also the Foreign Minister. We don't have a formal policy, but it would seem that if expensive weapons systems are an option for the region, then surely some of the countries in this would be able to increase their climate finance commitments proportionately, and I really look forward to that. And this morning, Fijian Prime Minister participated in a meeting on climate finance, on trying to secure the COP26 outcomes with the Secretary General and Prime Minister of UK. It was a point he made very strongly, so I'm restating that.
Thank you, Ambassador. You mentioned climate financing to the question on the security alliance on the nuclear submarines, but coming to the question of climate change and the Blue Pacific, you mentioned it a couple of times in your speech. In your role here, where you are really spearheading a lot of the conversation on the challenges islands face, what is your biggest challenge in your conversations in generating that interest amongst the bigger powers or the other countries who have an equal stake or responsibility towards the concerns and the challenges that you face, but might not be on the top of the agenda because, again, as you said, security perceptions are different. So while for you, climate change might be at the top of the agenda for a security concern, it might not be the similar for your neighbors who are bigger powers. So how do you manage that? What is the biggest challenge in your conversations?
So that is very true. Darsha, look, the United Nations here in New York is a very crowded place. There's 192 countries, and 192 countries have their interests and issues and challenges, and all of them are ventilated on the floor of General Assembly and its committees. And but if you distill all the many issues and lump them together, and what are the big macro global issues, and whether these issues resonate with us in Fiji and in the Pacific, across the Blue Pacific, then two of the biggest issues that our leaders will be discussing, I think most substantively this week, one will be climate change, and whether we are on on track and what we need to do to get on track. I'm quite convinced that a majority of world's leaders will reflect on this and will give some guidance on how we can increase momentum, pace, and we might not end up fully satisfied, but I think that is very clear. The second issue that I think, and you would have picked up from social media and from what countries are saying that their priority issues will be at UN General Assembly 76. Most of them are saying that COVID recovery, both access to vaccines as well as the social and economic recovery, and you know that for all countries that the impact of COVID has been deep, and we are saying that they've been deepest. The socioeconomic impact has been deepest on the smaller states. As a ratio of GDP, they've been hurt most significantly. But everyone has suffered, and everyone needs to get their minds and resources and technical know-how and knowledge together to get us out of the immediate, both the health and the socioeconomic crisis that it has unleashed, and try to return to a path of SDGs as in the shortest possible period of time. So this, I think, will be the largest issues that our leaders will be discussing over the next 2 weeks. Both of them resonate very closely with us and our immediate priorities. So in some ways, if that's one way of thinking about it, when you lump the many national issues together into larger categories, the two biggest ones that are being discussed resonate with us. So we think, therefore, we are in sync with what the leaders collectively will be deciding on. And so that is a good position to be in. But if we are facing very specific issues which do not get airtime, the broader cross-section of UN membership and leadership, then we'd be at odds. I think we are not. It is more about commitment and the level of commitment and whether we can get that in the right space.
If I can just follow up on that in terms of the right kind of commitment, is there some in particular that you're expecting from the current U.S. administration on this issue, the kind of commitment or the kind of investment that you would like to see that you think would make a difference, at least in starting the conversations or working towards the issues that you and your colleagues would like to be addressed on the issue of Blue Pacific?
So thanks for that. I don't think there's a U.S. and Pacific straight dialogue. I mean, much of this dialogue is global. The issue of vaccines for all is a global issue. All countries are in the suffering in one way or the other. Fiji and many of the Pacific countries, we are a bit ahead of the curve. But having said that, many countries in Africa are still at 5% vaccination rates, and the access, they do not see the line of sight on when they'll be able to reach 50-60% rates, etc. So US is a very large player in this. It's the home of at least 3 of the major vaccines on the world market. But everyone has to come together in this. More of the vaccines need to be made available to the COVAX facility, and through that then routed and distributed in a more equitable way. So that's, but in addition to that, for Fiji at least, for a few of the Pacific Island countries, they would have said we have had very generous support from US in accessing vaccines. Fiji has been able to, has been given 100,000 plus Moderna vaccines. For North Pacific have more or less been covered by US vaccines. So they've been very, US has been extremely generous in that way to the Pacific, as has been our neighbors, Australia, New Zealand, India, and many other countries. Yeah.
Thank you, Ambassador. I'm going to open up this conversation to for question and answers from in-house, but I do have a few questions virtually. So while our in-person audience collects the questions, let me come to you from one that virtually our virtual participants have put through. Who do you think are Fiji's main allies in fighting this climate-caused insecurity? Fiji's main allies in fighting this climate-caused security challenge?
Well, I hope everybody is our ally in this, anybody not in this space is not our ally. That much is very very clear. If you are following Fiji's Prime Minister, was extremely active on the global stage. When he speaks directly to the citizens of the world rather than to their governments. So the first starting point for climate actions are actions that individuals take. Then we are also fully cognizant of the fact that the largest impacts on the climate, adverse impacts on the climate are by large corporations. And so we speak to the corporations directly. And then finally, you speak to the governments. So we continue speaking. I think it's not about who your allies are and who your allies are not. It is about always expanding these coalitions at different levels, that more and more individuals across the planet understand their carbon footprint and are doing more. More and more companies understand their carbon footprint and doing the right things in making the transition. And more countries are committing themselves to their NDCs and expanding their ambition in their NDCs. And so our diplomacy is about expanding these coalitions at all levels with as much as we can do. Of course, not individually we do that, but as collective groups of Pacific Island, small island developing states, using the Pacific Island Forum, using AOCs, as I said, and the other groupings that we are part of.
Thank you, Ambassador. We have a question from the audience, Professor. The mic is just by you.
Thank you very much.
It's on.
Thank you very much, Excellency. And really grateful to Carnegie and the Sasakawa Peace Foundation for giving this platform for non-hegemonic perspectives as well, because I think that's very often a missing conversation here. So really grateful for that. Two specific questions. You made a reference to the presidential statement under the Indian presidency in the Security Council on maritime security. I'd be curious to see how do you see that evolving or developing further if there is another iteration of that. Would a Chapter 7 resolution subsequently be useful? What elements might you want to see in, or how might you build on that presidential statement, given your own kind of interests and the fact that the rest of the world is equally concerned with that? Second, you did not make a reference to the Our Common Agenda report the Secretary General just released, and I was curious to see what elements of those do you think are immediate, viable, practical, and those which are not likely to get global support. Thank you so much.
Master.
Thanks very much for both those excellent questions. First, we really welcomed and we we offered a statement in the first UN Security Council discussion on maritime security held under the presidency of India last month. And that was in our several discussions on this in shaping, in helping to shape that debate. We asked for an expanded understanding and scope of maritime security. Some of the issues I've touched on in my remarks earlier this afternoon. Maritime security is the climate impacts on maritime security. It goes in many ways across the maritime areas, etc. You have a network of wharves and ports and storage areas, etc. And many of these are exposed to one, sea level rise, and two, extreme weather events. And so you are looking at a maritime a more unsettled period of maritime trade, and we asked for a better reflection of what this means. Now, this is not only something that affects small states, but it affects every country. Most of the trade in all countries, barring the landlocked countries, are via the sea routes, and all of the ports and the trading infrastructure are on coastal areas, and all of them, wherever, are exposed to sea level rise, and some of them more and some of them less, to extreme weather events, depending on where you are. And we've asked that we'll keep on working with the member states as well as the permanent members and members of the Security Council to expand this understanding. And as I said, for small states, the impact of that is quite brutal and very sharp. For large states, you may have 20, 30, 50 ports, and 2 or 3 of them are affected. For small states, you might have 1 or 2 ports, and if they are affected, they are affecting a much larger ratio of your overall trade. And in cyclones and hurricanes, we always this is a big challenge to us because straight after destruction, you have to mobilize a humanitarian response, and if your wharves and jetties and ports are blown away, how do you land ships and supplies and life-saving equipment and so on? So it also has a humanitarian side. But I hope that discussion goes forward, and we working with many countries. We were amongst one of the early countries to ask the Security Council to consider discussions about climate and security many years back, nearly 20 years back, and we have persistently been hounding the Security Council that the security consequences of climate change are a Security Council issue. They go beyond development, and now we are heartened that there's a growing appreciation, and not yet as far as we want it to go, but a growing appreciation that the security consequences of climate change are real, they are growing, and that the Security Council does need to engage with this. On the second question, our common agenda. Sorry, I was being timed off. I was getting signals that I was talking too long. But I did reflect on our common agenda. Look, we have welcomed our common agenda report. The Secretary General and his team have reflected deeply. For those who do not know, as part of the UN at 75, there was a listening process, and the UN listened to many people across the world on whether the UN as a system was fit for purpose in its 75th year anniversary. And my own views, or Fiji's own views, was that the COVID-19, while UN was celebrating or trying to mark its 75th anniversary, it was also at the time when COVID hit the world. And in some ways you can see whether the COVID-19 was the stress test for UN at 75. And I don't want to say it lightly. It was perhaps the stress test that it needed, and it was found to have performed well in parts and found wanting in parts. So I think it was useful, and the Secretary General has reflected very much on this, and I hope that member states, we now have time to consider the report and its details, will welcome our common future report. Will examine the proposals, very deeply thought through proposals, and that we will rally behind the main proposals and try to get a UN system that is fit for purpose for the next 75 years. So I'm very hopeful, and that a UN system in which we won't have to try to every day overcome some of the problems that some of the smaller states have been suffering with. Many of the rules of multilateralism were decided at a time when we are not members of the United Nations or of multilateral systems. And so there's a legacy issue, and every day half our time is trying to fight battles or fixing problems that were given to us at a time when small states did not have a voice in the international system or a presence in the international system. Our common future provides us with that opportunity to fix some of those problems of the past, as well as to position the UN to really address the issue of global commons. And two of the global commons I've been talking about much today, and that the UN system will be capable of responding to the challenges that our shared parts of humanity face and confront.
Thank you, Ambassador, for sharing that. Are there any other questions from the audience in person? Mike here, please.
Thank you so much for speaking today. My name is Nydia. I'm a researcher at the Project on International Peace and Security. When you talk a lot about climate resiliency and adaptation, I know Fiji has led in a lot of mass relocation of villages to combat sea level rise. I was wondering, as you look into the future for climate resiliency funding and projects, do you see mass relocation as the types of projects you're looking to fund? Or are there other types of resiliency projects that you're looking at?
Thank you. Thank you for picking that up. Very important. One of the things that I'd said in my response to the earlier question is, sometimes we seem to be very passionate about these issues. It is not because we are passionate. We are expressive people, so we are passionate. But we see the problems sometimes ahead of, before they hit larger countries. So in the Pacific, people are on the move. They've been on the move for years now. In Fiji alone, we are committed to moving 45 villages. We need to relocate them. And none of these relocations are easy for anyone who thinks that relocating communities is easy. It is very hard work. It is not only about physically moving, 200-300 people and their families to higher ground, moving their health centers, building new roads, moving their schools. In case all of that was easy, try moving their churches. If you thought that was easy, try moving burial grounds. This is very hard work, yeah. But we've been doing this in the Pacific for years. Fiji, Solomon Islands, Papua New Guinea, across most of the countries, and some of the countries are quietly contemplating a future where they may not have any land above sea level within this century, in less than a century. So that's one. But these numbers are on a global scale small because we have not too many people. You apply the same logic and the same level of sea level rise to Bangladesh or coastal areas in Asia, then numbers multiply very quickly, and try relocating then tens of millions of people and, God forbid, hundreds of millions of people. And within the next 30 to 50 years at 3 degrees Celsius, that is the type of numbers that are beginning to look into play, that within the next 25 years or so, you are looking at a potential pool of 300 to 500 million people in Asia alone who will need to be moved in this way with the same level of difficulty. People, communities, homes, roads, infrastructure, health, schools, everything that goes to make a community move. So this is very hard. This is going to be very, very hard, and that is why we think that this is the geopolitical and the tussle of our time is getting on the right side of the climate action and climate debates.
Thank you, Ambassador. We are almost at time, so let me pose to you my final question from one of our virtual participants, and I also welcome you to share any of your closing remarks and thoughts you might have. How do you think larger countries can work with Fiji without overpowering your voice when dealing with pressing regional concerns?
Well, just work with us. One, of course, we have our bilateral relations, and they provide a strong platform, and we have very strong bilateral relations with just about every country here in the broader Pacific neighborhood. And second is that on the global issues that are not so much, that are of importance to Fiji, as I've been talking about, oceans and climate change and biodiversity, but that are issues of the planet. work together. That, when we will go that extra mile, you take half a mile.
Thank you, Ambassador. Any closing thoughts, remarks on this?
To thank both Carnegie and Sasakawa Peace Foundation for convening this discussion, and I'm really honored that you've invited me to share some remarks and to interact with your audience, both here and digitally. And thank you also for convening this meeting at this time on the eve of General Assembly. I think that was very useful. It's helped us think about some of the issues and some of the messages, as well as share some of our messages with your larger community. And I encourage you to continue these discussions, and I hope that each year in advance of the General Assembly, we can have a conversation with the large ocean states and the views of the large ocean states as the impact on the global commons and in the global settings can also be heard and ventilated and discussed. And so congratulations and thank you very much for giving me this honor.
Thank you so much, Ambassador, and I really appreciate you highlighting the value of the forum, as we are looking to convene this every year, and we look toward your support and your government support in coming back and sharing your ideas, thoughts, perspectives, and insights. With that, I'll bring this panel to a close. Please join me in thanking the Ambassador for what I think was a fantastic conversation. We are really grateful for your time, especially again on the eve of the UN General Assembly and the high-level week. Thank you so much, Ambassador.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Just a quick note for our